Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. We, is Muhammad is here? Can you send that quotation to Abdul Nasser, the one?
Yes, I did. I asked you, you said that for me. I sent it.
You sent to me. Can you send to him?
I sent.
Because I can't read it from my phone. I'm recording.
Can you send it to me?
Okay. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. We wanted to conclude what we started yesterday, that the one who abandons the salah out of neglect or laziness, or out of being busy with dunya, we mentioned that the vast majority of scholars do not consider him a disbeliever, while some do, especially some of the Hanabila. But let me see what Imam al-Nawawi has said about this matter. He mentioned some evidence. Imam Nawawi says in his explanation of Sahih Muslim, he says, وَأَمَّا تَارِكُ الصَّلَاةِ فَإِنْ كَانَ مُنْكَرًا لِوُجُوبِهَا فَهُوَ كَافِرٌ بِإِجْمَاعِ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. If he rejects that the salah is a legislation of Allah that is mandatory on Muslims, of course, if he refuses this concept, then he is a disbeliever. And there's a consensus of all scholars that he is a disbeliever. If he totally considers the salah, the prayer, not a part of Islam, of course, then he's not a Muslim. إلا أن يكون قريب عهد بالإسلام. Unless he was a new Muslim and doesn't know this fact, then we would excuse him for not knowing, and we would teach that person, right? وإن كان تركه تكاسلا مع اعتقاده وجوبها كما هو حال كثير من الناس فقد اختلف العلماء فيه، فذهب مالك والشافعي رحمهم الله والجماهير من السلف والخلف إلى أنه لا يكفر. He says, but if he did not perform salah because he was lazy to do it, just like it is the case for most people who do not pray, that's what he says, then the scholars have differed on this matter. Imam Malik, and of course his school of Imam Malik, not alone, but all his students and people who follow this school of thought, and the Shafi'iyya, وجماهير من السلف والخلف, and the vast majority of scholars who are old and new, they say that he is not a disbeliever. لا يكفر بل يفسق ويستتاب فإن تاب وإلا قتلناه حدا كالزاني المحصن. They say no, he is just somebody who is a sinner, not a disbeliever, and he would be called to make tawbah, to repent to Allah. But they consider that there is a penalty on abandoning salah completely, which could mount to the death penalty. You follow? They say just like the person who has committed adultery while he was somebody who was married. You follow? And also a killer, the death penalty applies to him as well. وذهب جماعة من السلف إلى أنه يكفر، وهو مروي عن علي بن أبي طالب كرم الله وجهه، وهو إحدى الروايتين عن أحمد، وبقال عبد الله مبارك وإسحاق بن راهوي، وهو وجه لبعض الشافعية. وذهب أبو حنيفة وجماعة من أهل الكوفة والمزني صاحب الشافعي رحمهم الله إلى أنه لا يكفر ولا يقتل. So some, of course, said he is not a believer, such as Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu, Abdullah ibn Mubarak, we mentioned this yesterday, or Ishaq ibn Rahawi. But Imam Abu Hanifa, for instance, and many scholars, or some scholars of Al-Kufa, Wal-Muzani, he was a Shafi'i scholar, a great Shafi'i scholar, he say that he is not a disbeliever. And we don't apply the penalty of death on him. So that's even a more lenient stance, that there is no penalty death, ولا يقتل بل يعذر, but he is to be punished, some form of punishment, such as being imprisoned or so on. ويحبس حتى يصلي. Now, and then he says those who consider him a disbeliever, they use this hadith as evidence, the one we've been reading, بين الرجل وبين الشرك والكفر ترك الصلاة. Between the person and disbelief and polytheism is to abandon salah. But as we mentioned, it could be understood in a different way. The barrier between the person and polytheism and kufr is tark as-salah, is to abandon salah, which means that if he abandons salah, he is at a high risk of losing his faith and reaching this level of total disbelief. It can happen. What keeps your Iman alive except your good deeds, right? And your connection with Allah. So abandoning salah is an extremely dangerous situation. Now, Imam al-Shafi'i one time had a debate with Imam Ahmad, a very short debate, and I'll just read it to you. Shafi'i met Imam Ahmad. Imam Ahmad considered him a disbeliever, considered the person who abandoned salah a disbeliever. So Imam Shafi'i was against this opinion. He said to him, he says, do you say that the person, he says to Imam Ahmad, do you say that the person who doesn't pray is a disbeliever out of laziness? He says, yes, I do. He says to him, how can he enter Islam? He says, he has to say, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. Imam Shafi'i responded, he says, well, he's regularly saying it. If you go to somebody who doesn't pray, does he not say Shahada? He says it all the time. He might be talking to you and say, La ilaha illallah, right? So he says to him, how can he become Muslim? He says Shahada. He says, well, he's saying it all the time, anyhow. And he tells you that he believes in it, of course, right? He says to him, so Imam Ahmad responded, then he has to start praying to become a Muslim. Look at the response of Imam Shafi'i. He says to him, how can Allah accept a prayer from a non-Muslim? You follow? It says the prayer is not acceptable for him to start praying if he's not a Muslim. It becomes a dilemma for people who consider him a non-Muslim. How can he go back to Islam? They say he says La ilaha illallah. Well, he's saying it already and he tells you I believe in it. Then they say no, he has to start praying to become a Muslim again. But you're telling me he's a kafir. How can a kafir pray? Can a kafir pray? No. It becomes a big dilemma for them, right? That's a very nice logical response from Imam Shafi'i. Now, let me just finish this part as well. And he mentioned, of course, the hadith, Imam Nawawi, he mentioned the hadith of خمس صلوات كتبهن الله على العباد في اليوم والليلة فمن جاء بهن لم يضيع منهن شيئا استخفافا بحقهن كان له عند الله عهد أن يدخله الجنة ومن لم يأت بهن فليس له عند الله عهد إن شاء عذبه إن شاء أدخله الجنة. We read this hadith yesterday, that Allah has made 5 prayers obligatory on the Muslim. Whoever performs them, then Allah has a promise for him to admit him to paradise. If he did not perform them, then he has no promise from Allah. Allah may forgive or punish that person. If he was a kafir, he would never be forgiven. And we mentioned the hadith also, أخرجوا من النار من قال من لم يفعل خيرا قط ومن قال لا إله الله ثم مات على ذلك دخل الجنة. There's many ahadith that would go against him being a kafir. Finally, he says, وأن إجماع المسلمين فإننا لا نعلم في عصر من الأعصار أحدا من تارك الصلاة ترك تغسيله والصلاة عليه. Imam al-Nawawi says, I've never heard in the history of Muslims that somebody who abandoned salah, that the Muslims decided not to perform ghusl or prayer for them. That's very important. That's a very important testimony. If this was a fact that was known amongst the Muslims and was a strong opinion, we would have heard of things like this in the past history. But he says this never happened. Never happened that they would not pray for him or do ghusl for him or bury them amongst the Muslims or prevent them from inheritance, because if he's non-Muslim, they shouldn't inherit from a Muslim, and the opposite is true as well, right? And he says, and then we never heard that they used to separate between a person and his wife. He says this is unheard of in the history of Muslims. That's what Imam al-Nawawi is saying. He says, ولو كان كافرا لثبتت هذه الأحكام كلها ولا نعلم بين المسلمين خلافا في أن تارك الصلاة يجب عليه قضاؤها ولو كان مرتدا لم يجب عليه قضاؤه. He says also, we know that a person who doesn't pray, we tell them that they have to make up for their lost prayers. But if he was a kafir, we would not tell them this, because a kafir has no obligation to perform the individual actions that normally a Muslim would be performing. Anyhow, we will stop here now.
So one of the big issues, if you take most adult Muslims today, most people don't pray 5 times a day.
Exactly.
They're probably 70%, I'm guessing.
Yeah, in some places, yes. Many large portion of Muslims.
I think that these interpretations of this hadith are very critical, because you're saying that 70% of Muslims are not kuffar.
Exactly. It's a big issue. If somebody adopts that kind of opinion, then he would consider many Muslims. And then what is What is the cutoff point of them considering him a kafir or non-kafir? Is it 1 prayer, 2 prayers, 1 day of not praying, 2 days of not praying? What is your measure? When do you start making the distinction between this person being a Muslim or a non-Muslim? Is it 1 year or 2 years? You will never reach a consensus on this matter. You have to have a clear-cut point. But yes, if he says, I don't agree that I have to pray, then of course, this is istighfafan bihinna. Then he is not a Muslim. He doesn't even approve of it being an obligation from Allah Azza wa Jal. If he did it istikbaran, al-kibr, inad, istikbaran, he says, I will never pray no matter what. This could also be a kufr. If he is exposed to punishment and he says, no, I will accept the punishment, but I will never pray, that's inad and istikbar. That may be also kufr. But short of this, it's very difficult to consider that person a non-Muslim. Now.